Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am fine. Was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as
I'm gonna have to be in your lap.
the sun.
That's fine.
We've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun.
Good morning. My name is Deb Gang, and Sue Kelley and I will be leading today's service. Reverend Matt Alspaugh will be presenting our message this morning. Our opening words are by Kristen Harper. Each day provides us with an opportunity to love again, to hurt again, to embrace joy, to experience unease, to discover the tragic. Each day provides us with the opportunity to live. This day is no different, this hour no more unique than the last, except maybe today, maybe now, among friends and fellow journeyers, maybe for the first time, maybe silently, we can share ourselves. And so now I just want to welcome you with, live from Fellowship Hall, it's our LCUUF Sunday service. Our announcements were on a slideshow before the service. If you didn't see them, don't worry. They'll be sent by email in the next day or so. And now, a special welcome to our visitors. If you're visiting with us for the first time or have returned or reconnected with us after a long absence, we invite you to say your name and tell us where you're from. Use the Zoom raise hand feature or just turn your video on and wave your hand, and we'll ask you to unmute. Is there anyone new with us today? Okay. Well, welcome to everyone who's with us. Our chalice lighting words today are by Martha Kirby Capo. Through the week, this chalice abides, cupped and silent. Softly it gleams in a dimly lit room, complete unto itself. Today we come together as a community of faith, joyful and free. Our individual energies combine to spark the flame of truth. May we each draw strength for the other, and like the chalice, may we be bathed in the fire of commitment to social justice, equity, and peace. Now let us light our chalice with these words that we sing together.
We kindle this light in celebration for the life that we share. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. We walk hand in hand. We walk hand in hand. We walk hand in hand someday. Oh, holy in my heart, I do believe we'll walk hand in hand someday. We shall all be free. We shall all be free. We shall all be free someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall all be free someday. We shall live in peace. We shall live in peace. We shall live in peace someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall live in peace someday.
Each week, we take time to remind ourselves that we belong to a community which cares for each other. We do this by sharing any significant joys or sorrows in our lives. If you have a joy or sorrow to share today, you can type it into the chat now and we'll read those aloud. First, let us voice our sorrows or concerns, whatever you or the world may be holding that is in need of our healing and caring thoughts. You're welcome to type sorrows and concerns in the chat box. Do we have any sorrows to be shared today?
Yes, we do, Deb. From Liz Hill and Reverend Matt. They have a concern that Matt's two sisters and their husbands have evacuated from their homes in Denmark, West Australia, due to a bushfire raging in the area. It's been over 40 degrees Celsius and very dry, and everyone is hoping the forecast for rain and cooling temperatures will soon come to pass. A joyful update this morning. The weather shifted and they've gotten the all clear on the bushfire in Australia. Another concern from Devorah Kelley. Please light a candle for my sister Judy, who died a week ago in Florida. Please light another candle for Devorah's mom, who at 98 outlived 2 of her 3 children. Please light a candle from Larry Peel, who says, hope for speedy recovery for his daughter in Virginia following a fall during a motel fire and evacuation. That's all I see.
Now let us recall the joys, whatever you may be celebrating, whatever evokes a feeling of joy or peace for yourself or others. You're welcome to type joys in the chat box now. Are there any joys to be shared?
Gosh, I'm not seeing any, but we can't go without joy. Let me make one up. I'm joyful that I haven't had to light the fireplace this winter here. Okay.
Okay. And this
I'm
candle
great-
from our, sorry. And this candle
Sorry,
from our,
we've got one from Marcia.
okay.
Marcia, go ahead.
I'm grateful that I'm here in Chapala and not in Buffalo, New York at this time of year.
And this candle from our care team represents those sorrows that are too raw, too difficult for us to share aloud. So many of us have had losses, partners, children, grandchildren, losses that remain present with us every day. So many of us have burdens, anger, fear, and frustration, all of those things that weigh heavy on our hearts. We light this candle for all those unspoken sorrows.
Well, let me invite you into a time of meditation, a time of personal reflection, a time to just center with yourself, to be with yourself, with your body, your mind, and with the universe. So just find a comfortable position, whatever that might be for you, and just check in with your body as you kind of get comfortable. And why don't we turn to the breath, that one resource that we all have, that one thing that we can all feel anytime we want to. Just notice the in-breath and the out-breath, and the in-breath and the out-breath. Just notice your breathing. And if distractions arise, just return to the breath. Now, let us return to this time to be together again.
Good morning. My name is Sue Kelley, and I grew up in Muskogee, Oklahoma, 50 miles southeast of Tulsa. But before we go into my experiences with the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, I would like to give you some background. On May 31st, 1921, mobs of white residents of Tulsa, Oklahoma were incensed at the thought of a possible rape of a white woman by a black man, which has since been proved untrue. Prior to this date, the Greenwood district of Tulsa, then called Black Wall Street, was very prosperous, with homes, schools, churches, businesses, and even a library. The black community stayed in Greenwood. They had no need for anything on the south side of Tulsa except for possible employment. This was the most successful black community in the United States. However, the white community did not believe that the blacks were entitled to such success and were waiting for an incident such as this one as an excuse to riot. The massacre went on through June 1st when the National Guard was brought in. However, they were given guns to the white rioters. The white rioters were running rampant through the Greenwood district, killing all they saw and looting and burning everything else. As a result, 800 people were admitted to hospitals. Blacks were in the basement of a local hospital as their hospital had been burned to the ground. 6,000 blacks were rounded up and interned in tent cities for several months. The exact count of the dead is unknown, anywhere from 75 to 300. 10,000 black people were homeless. In today's numbers, real and personal property damage was in the amount of $32.65 million. What resulted in the aftermath of these events must be the biggest cover-up in the history of mankind. All of my public school education was in the Muskogee School District. Nothing. I took Oklahoma history and EZA at Oklahoma State University. Nothing. Never was one word uttered about this event. My husband went through the Stillwater public school system. Nothing. Lynn Cleek and my brother, who came later, would not learn of these events either. Nothing. How could something so horrific be so completely erased from history? The cover-up not only was designed to bury all evidence, how do you bury blocks and blocks of burned out buildings, but to shift the blame from the whites to the blacks. Governor Robertson went to Tulsa to restore order and ordered a commission to study the problem. This did not last long as the grand jury concluded that blacks had started the event. When the remaining residents of Greenwood tried to rebuild, they met all kinds of resistance from local authorities. The local developers had plans for Greenwood, which did not work as Greenwood residents refused to sell their land. Fire ordinances were passed to stop the blacks from building, but eventually were declared unconstitutional. At this point, blacks were threatened with their lives, their families' lives, and their businesses if they dared to comment on the events of the Tulsa Massacre and the aftermath. Documents were burned, and eventually those involved died. In March 2001, the 118 remaining survivors, there are 2 survivors remaining today, were awarded a gold medal. In April 2001, the governor of Oklahoma finally signed a document that said the massacre did happen and the 1921 Tulsa Race Riot Reconciliation Act provided 300 scholarships for descendants of the Greenwood Massacre. Today, a forensic team is working on identifying 11 coffins that were discovered in a mass grave. Are there others? A century later, the once thriving community of Greenwood has been reduced to one short block, divided by a highway and surrounded by new development, including a minor league baseball stadium, luxury apartment complex, and a new museum. It is called Greenwood Rising. Efforts are underway to restore Greenwood to its former glory as Black Wall Street. In 2020, a campaign was underway to raise $10 million to help this effort. The economic impact of the massacre is still present to this day, as is seen in the poverty levels and mortality rates in North Tulsa. What do I take away from this? First, it makes me wonder about all the history I was taught in public schools, especially that surrounding the Civil War and the American Indian. It concerns me for all the book destruction that is going on right now that contains information that others do not want us to know. My heart bleeds for those whose lives were completely destroyed. And again, I am totally baffled as to how something this horrific could be so completely erased. As of 2020, an extensive curriculum on the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre was introduced in the Oklahoma public schools. The youth of Oklahoma can now know what really happened without censorship or altered versions of the truth.
Hold tight, we're working on the sound.
American training that vilifies white people and demands they apologize.
The best learning for students about social studies and about our democracy and our country is the learning where students can really grapple with the issues and really come to a deeper understanding of how our past informs our present.
All of this revisionist, woke curriculum, you are not going to do this to our children.
Teachers across the country are caught in the middle of the latest flashpoint in America's culture war, critical race theory. So what exactly is it? And why is there a push to ban it in schools?
Critical race theory is a body of ideas and a set of approaches to understanding the history and the present of American society that looks at the ways in which racial unfairness have been woven into the fabric of our institutions.
In other words, critical race theory, or CRT for short, is a legal academic framework centered on the idea that racism is systemic. It first started to coalesce in the 1970s, when Black, Hispanic, and Asian legal scholars were researching the persistence of inequality despite the landmark legal victories of the civil rights era.
The legal scholars undertook a set of analyses and investigations that were aimed at trying to make sense of the puzzling persistence of racism in our legal system, in our political system, in our economy.
CRT has been studied in fields like sociology, economics, and political science. It's been used to examine issues such as housing and educational segregation, unconscious bias, and criminal justice reform.
Contrary to what often critics portray as sort of judging people intrinsically as being racist or not, or holding people responsible for, slavery in the past, it is actually to open up a conversation of how we all inherit and live in a society sort of beyond our choosing, right? We didn't choose where we were born or what racial group we were part of, and yet we have this common history. How do we understand that history? What does it mean for us? Those are the sorts of questions that critical race theorists were trying to grapple with.
The racial reckoning spurred by the police killing of George Floyd brought the decades-old framework back into the spotlight, as some schools sought to implement reforms that better address race in classrooms.
I think the thing that critical race theory would add to that conversation is that we not sort of confine that horrific example to Derek Chauvin, but to think about how, well, there were other law enforcement officers present, including officers of color, who stood idly by. And so that pushes us to think about, this phenomenon as not simply one of, racism by whites against blacks, right? I mean, it makes us think more critically, more engaged, more seriously around, well, why do these practices happen?
The push against CRT gained steam under former President Trump, when he directed federal agencies to end any diversity trainings related to critical race theory. Though ultimately blocked on First Amendment grounds and rescinded by President Biden, the fight over CRT at the state level is still in full effect.
The focus on CRT is a way to latch onto a concept that very few people sort of really understand, which sounds kind of scary perhaps to someone not, trained in what it means, and latch onto that as a kind of football in this sort of ongoing fight over, the future of this country with regard to racism.
As of mid-June 2021, 21 states have introduced bills attempting to restrict the teaching of critical race theory and/or impose limits on how race is discussed inside the classroom. And those limits are often vague.
And instructors, educators, especially at the K through 12 level, will just not go there, will not run the risk of upsetting parents or, being misunderstood or drawing the ire of, lawmakers.
In Texas, for instance, House Bill 3979 says teachers must explore current events from multiple positions without giving, quote, deference to any one perspective.
There's language in this bill, like teachers need to present a balanced perspective on current events, for instance. They have to do their due diligence to present multiple viewpoints. But what happens if they're talking about an issue in the classroom and they try to present multiple viewpoints, but the student comes home and tells their parent about the lesson that day, and the parent thinks, well, they didn't do a good enough job of presenting this viewpoint. So who decides when the teacher has done an adequate job of presenting multiple perspectives on an issue? It saddens me and disappoints me that instead of really embracing this opportunity to confront our nation's past and to tell authentic and more accurate narratives about experiences of diverse people in this country, that we're looking to sweep it under the rug. We're looking to erase it even further from our memories.
Morning. This week I was involved in a real estate transaction to purchase a home here in Mexico. I was surprised how few documents I had to sign, but one stood out. It was an affirmation that my property would be governed under the Constitution of Mexico, and further, that I would not invoke the protection of my own government in disputes. Initially, I thought this was a curious requirement, but on reflection, I realized that, of course, this made sense. Mexico had lost a huge portion of its land to the United States, in part because it had allowed American settlers into Texas. Some of those settlers owned enslaved people, and when Mexico, after becoming independent from Spain, eliminated slavery, those settlers began to agitate for a fight. Thus, we had the Texas Revolutionary War and the subsequent annexation of Texas by the United States. So little wonder that Mexico would be a little bit edgy about giving too much power to settlers from the north. Now today, I'm focusing mostly on my own experience based on my birth and life in the United States of America. I realize that race issues exist in other places. I'm just less able to comment on them. So I grew up in Houston, Texas, and was subjected to public school education while there. I did receive a relatively decent education, though it included several required courses on Texas and American history. The Texas history material was most problematic. Mexico was painted as a cruel and backward aggressor in the Texas Revolution. The whole history program was tainted by the lost cause mythology popular in the South. The lost cause myth, to quote historian Elizabeth Garner Masaryk, refashions the Civil War as the honorable and heroic struggle of a knightly Christian South against an immoral invader, the North, with vastly greater resources and troop strength. I remember little about the Reconstruction era from those classes, other than the terms carpetbagger and scalawag. These were supposedly those horrible people from the North, with their Southern sympathizers respectively, who were portrayed merely as exploiting the defeated Southerners. It surprises me and pains me to realize that I learned little about the accomplishments made by freed blacks in this short period before the real oppression of the Jim Crow era began. But gradually over the decades, I've learned a different history, not in a coordinated way, not in some school classroom, but small bits, pieces, facts that have caused me to question and doubt much of what I was taught about U.S. and Texas and world history. Let me give you some examples of these little nuggets of truth I've learned. That the particular and convoluted organization of the Electoral College, which dilutes the power of the popular vote in the United States, was a political compromise created to protect the interests of the slaveholding states. That the Second Amendment to the Constitution, allowing both state militias and the right of people to keep and bear arms, was written primarily to allow slaveholders and slave state militias to suppress slave attempts for freedom. That the science of time and motion studies and early scientific management had their origin in getting the maximum output from slave bodies. That many of the finance and accounting ideas I learned from my business degree had their origins in the slave economy. So the concept of depreciating assets was invented to account for the aging bodies of enslaved people. And the system of debt financing was developed in part to allow Southern slave owners to mortgage their slaves to Northern bankers so they could, what? Buy more slaves. And as time passed, the antebellum system of systemic slavery evolved into a postbellum system of systemic racism. More nuggets from that history. That city planners used economic arguments to build interstate highways right through poor black and minority neighborhoods, dividing or destroying them, as we heard about in Tulsa. That the Federal Housing Administration conspired to limit home mortgages in neighborhoods populated with blacks, and instead preferentially funded white neighborhoods. These poor neighborhoods were often lined out in red on city maps, like this one of Chicago, thus the phrase redlining. That horrors like the Tulsa Race Massacre could occur and then be erased from history, as Sue Kelley described. I only learned about the Tulsa Massacre because Reverend Marlon Lavenhar, the minister of All Souls Unitarian Universalists in Tulsa, has spoken about this topic for many years. That the war on drugs and the consequential mass incarceration of people of color was less motivated by an increase in violent crime than a deliberate effort to push back the gains of the civil rights movement. A key example is the difference in criminalization of powder cocaine, preferred by white people, and crack cocaine used mostly by blacks. The only chemical difference between these two is the means of preparation, with crack cocaine having baking soda added. Yet, in the 1980s, the sentence for possessing a gram of crack cocaine was 100 times the sentence for possessing powder cocaine. that the killing of George Floyd, among many others, opened our eyes to a culture of tolerance for police violence against black people. That culture has been defended and endorsed at the highest levels of government, including the Supreme Court. All these small nuggets of truth have caused me to reflect on my high school education from a new perspective. My childhood Texas pride, yes, that's also a beer brand, has gone flat. Much of what I was taught was a lie. Let me quote historian Elizabeth Garner Masaryk again, who we heard who is also a fellow Texan. She captures my sentiments well. She says, "I find myself adrift, even angry sometimes. Angry that I was taught one thing, that elements of my land and people were systematically forgotten, and that the story that was perpetrated was only a half-truth. I learned Texas history as the white Texans and the occasional Tejano sympathizer were fighting for freedom from evil and debased Mexicans, and black people were nowhere to be found. That's pretty much the same way I learned about the Civil War. The southern states seceded because the evil North was trampling on their states' rights. It was all white men and not a woman or a black person in sight." So that was my experience too. Each new thing I learned about Texas history called into question what I'd been taught. And each new thing I learned about American history also raised similar questions. I began to approach everything I learned with what we in the ministry world call the hermeneutics of suspicion. That is to say, I began to read every historical account with a degree of skepticism and distrust, always looking for the underlying aspects that might motivate people to bend or distort the story. But while I began to look at everything with a high degree of suspicion, I didn't really have a label for my distrust. There was no grand unified theory, if you will, that connected all these various nuggets, these various things together. That is, there was nothing until I encountered the 1619 Project undertaken by the New York Times. It's named 1619 because it recognized the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first enslaved Africans into the Proto-American colony of Virginia in 1619. The 1619 Project opened my eyes to the unifying idea of critical race theory. The essential idea of critical race theory is that, and I quote from dictionary.com, many institutions are built to enforce systemic racism and oppression of people of color, and that this racism has a long history in the U.S. and the world, and that they are ongoing and driven by white supremacy. So it was in seeing all these things that I listed above with this perspective, through this lens of critical race theory, that things began to click together. Things that made me uneasy about my culture and its history. Things that I couldn't really put my finger on now began to make sense. I also began to see why making real change in many of these things was so heartbreakingly hard. Why at times we seem to have backslid in our progress. Hey, I just used the word backslid in a sermon. We backslid in this progress to create a more just and peaceable world. Now, after the 1619 Project was published, a huge conservative backlash erupted over critical race theory and whether it should be permitted to be taught in classrooms. At least 36 of the United States have attempted to ban the teaching of critical race theory or broader concepts of anti-racism. And with 2022, more state legislatures are considering such measures. In a previous sermon in June 2020, I explored the idea of the collective unconscious of Jungian psychology. The collective unconscious, or the shadow, is that part of our subconscious nature that we do not want to expose, that we will avoid examining. And just as individual people go to great lengths avoiding any exploration of their shadow qualities, perhaps too cultures will go to great lengths to avoid working on their shadow qualities. Let me suggest also a few other possible reasons why critical race theory may be so threatening to many people, even middle-of-the-road folks. I recently heard a podcast talk by Peter Dodd, a researcher who studies stories, the arc of stories, the quality of their characters, and so on. He said, I quote, "We tend to have stories wrapped around individuals, which I think is interesting because we want to be in them. It's hard for us to tell stories about systems. So the stories we like to tell have characters in them, good guys and bad guys, and we want to align with the good guys. But critical race theory posits that racism is systemic, that racism has been baked into many of the laws and institutions and structures of the land, and that it is enforced by ordinary law-abiding citizens just doing their jobs. There are no obviously evil people you can label racist, no Bull Connors or George Wallaces, nor obviously good people like Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks. Critical race theory isn't about that, it's about systems. It just isn't a good story, as stories go. Another reason could be that many people that are hostile to critical race theory fear that it will cause their children to lose their patriotism, their respect for their country. Whitney Goodman is a therapist who recently wrote a book called Toxic Positivity, which looks at the dangers of looking on the bright side of life. One of the chapters of this book is called Discrimination with a Smile, and she suggests that positivity is often used to shut down discussion about real problems. She says, I quote, "Positive platitudes and the pursuit of happiness are ultimately being used as tools to keep people submissive and quiet, when getting angry and expressing dissatisfaction are often one of the most effective ways to create change within a society." In my mind, attempts to shut down teaching and conversations on critical race theory are based on trying to hold up some mythical view of greatness of the American culture, which in itself is a story of toxic positivity. I remember thinking about Reverend Tim Schubert's remarks here last week, in which he noted his difficulty communicating with, much less loving, people who held vastly different beliefs than he did. I wondered how we might keep the dialogue going about critical race theory, even if it doesn't make for good storytelling, even if we're trying to talk with toxically positive, patriotic people. And I get it. I think about many relatives with whom I cannot have a useful, even civil conversation about critical race theory or racism. So I just don't have those conversations. Over a decade ago, I heard a presentation by Reverend Keith Cron, who was then in charge of the Welcoming Congregation program at the Unitarian Universalist Association. He was talking about how we might communicate with people in our congregations to help them become more welcoming to LGBTQ people. He noted that he had come to realize that people dwell on a continuum about controversial topics like sexuality and gender identity. And I think this is still true for racism. The continuum runs from those who are wholly opposed to the topic over to those who are enthusiastically supportive. His insight was that people will only listen to people who are relatively close to them on the continuum. So if you want to move people along the continuum, for example, to support for LGBTQ rights, you cannot have your most enthusiastic supporters to be your spokespeople. They won't be heard by those most oppressed. And on the previous slide, it was the ones with the X's. Those folks won't hear your enthusiastic supporters. They don't even use the same language, and so they will be ignored. Instead, you have to encourage people at various points along the continuum. Next slide, please. Nope, not that slide, yeah. To talk with people near them, to move them bit by bit towards that good outcome we'd like. He observed that this is a hard path. It takes time, but it is the best way to achieve the goals of the Welcoming Congregation program. And I think the same thing is true with conversations about race. I can't talk to some of my relatives about critical race theory because I'm too far away from them on that continuum. But I can talk to other relatives that are closer to me, and maybe they can talk to those relatives. And so bit by bit, we might help each other move out of the contentious divide that exists today in the United States and in so many other places around the world. And we don't need that slide anymore. Thank you. Not just about critical race theory, but about a whole handful of other topics that might divide us, so that we might, bit by bit, conversation by conversation, we might reweave the connections of love that reach across our difference. And bit by bit, we might create, as Reverend Tim says, a world that works for everyone. May it be so.
This is a time in our service when we ask that you remember that we share our gifts here through pledging and donations. Instructions for payments to the fellowship were on a slide during the announcements before the service every week. And while you are considering your gifts to the fellowship, remember that each month, LCUUF donates 5,000 pesos or more to an organization in our lakeside community. We share 1/2 of the offering collected at the fellowship each week with that organization. For the month of February, we are supporting Food Bank Lakeside, an organization which was started at the beginning of the pandemic to provide needed food security for local people. If you are not attending the fellowship in person, please donate to Share the Basket when you pay your pledge. Donate to Share the Basket separately or indicate what part of your donation is for Share the Basket. The offering will now be given and received. Let us extinguish our chalices with these words which we read together. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we keep in our hearts and share with all the world.
The story of critical race theory is at its core a search for truth, a recovery of things hidden long ago and in plain sight. But despite all, we shall know the truth, and the truth shall set all of us free. And may we use that freedom to fill the world with justice and dignity for all people everywhere. May it be so.
Going home, going home, I'm a going home, quiet like some still day, I'm just going home. It's not far, just close by, through an open door. Work all done, cares laid by, going to fear no more. Mother's there, expecting me, father's waiting too. Lots of folks gathered there, all the friends I knew. All the friends I knew. Morning star lights the way, restless dream all done, shadows gone, break of day, real life just begun. There's no break, there's no end, just a living on. Wide awake with a smile, going on and on. Going home, going home, I'm just going home. It's not far, just close by, through an open door. I'm just going